on the SAFS and Rational Space Network page. So just so you're aware. And I will start the recording now. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert Thomas. I'm a librarian at the Dr. John Archer Library, which I'm coming to you virtually from in Regina, Saskatchewan, at the University of Regina. I'm the host for today, and we are going to, let me just remember it here. We are going to be listening to a lecture by Sinclair MacRae, a professor at Mount Royal University. Francis Widdowson, who's also a professor at Mount Royal, will be introducing him in a moment. The title of the lecture is In Defense of Reason, Creating a Climate for Academic Freedom, Examining Joseph Heath's Enlightenment 2.0. I'm just going to talk a little bit. I guess, first of all, I just wanted to say that this has been brought to you by the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship and the Rational Space Network at Mount Royal University. We are going to just tell you a little bit about how it's going to go before I pass it along to Francis. We're going to have Francis introducing Sinclair MacRae, and then Sinclair will give his talk for about 30-40 minutes in that range. At the end of that, we will have a back and forth between Francis and Sinclair on the topic and some of the issues that it's presented. At the end of their back and forth, we'll have questions from the audience, and it's very important that we just understand how that will work. If you have a question for us, feel free to put it in the chat when Sinclair and Francis are going for their back and forth or afterwards. But don't give any questions to us during the talk itself, because these will go to the host, and Sinclair will be the host at that point, and I'm going to be the actual one choosing the questions. When I do choose a question, I will call on the person who asked it to ask it verbally, and then Sinclair will ask, and if you have any follow-ups, not extra questions, but any clarification you want from him or whatever, feel free. As a matter of etiquette, I would like everybody to mute their microphones unless they are the one talking, just to cut out any of the problems that we have with background noise or, screaming babies, screaming dogs, or I guess dogs don't scream, but it would be much appreciated for that. So I'm just going to pass this along to Francis, and she will give her introduction for Sync.
Thanks very much, Robert. Thanks everyone for attending this event. This is the first, I believe, video virtual event that we've tried, so we're hoping it's going to work out well. And this will mean that we are able to have a number of other events over the next couple of months, including the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship event that we're going to have in June. I'm a professor. My name is Francis Widdowson. I'm a professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University. I'm a board member for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship and the founding member of the Rational Space Network at Mount Royal University. I would highly recommend everyone join the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. It only costs $25 a year, and you get the newsletter, 3 copies of the newsletter. And Sinclair MacRae, who is going to give us this talk today, actually has an article in the last issue about respect, which is very interesting, plus many other very important articles about what's going on in universities today. In terms of my activities with the Rational Space Network, this organization has been around since 2016, but we've really only become active over the last 2 years. And I think it's a very, very important organization, and I'm hoping that other university campuses will develop branches of this. You can just start up your own. We have all the materials that we can provide to you just as open access. And the idea here is to develop a two-pronged approach with respect to academic freedom and open inquiry. You have your university level organization, and then you have your Canadian organization, which of course the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship is involved in orchestrating across the country. The idea is to build up an organizational backing for people who want to explore all ideas in the university setting, which people who are watching this talk will know is quite difficult right now at various universities. The Rational Space Network has been actively fighting against this. We have events on controversial issues, trying to explore them. For example, trans activism. We held a very important event last year. We looked at the Chicago principles during this term and examined street epistemology. And we also are involved in organizing at the university level, sending letters to administration about defending secularism. We've done that. And as well, we were actively involved in trying to defend a faculty member, Mark Hecht, from being mobbed at Mount Royal University. Unfortunately, we weren't entirely successful in that case, but I think we did raise awareness about some of the problems that exist in terms of discussing a number of contentious topics at the universities, at Mount Royal and other universities. Anyway, so just for your future reference, we're hoping to have a talk on self-censorship at some point over the next couple of months. And then the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship general meeting is happening on September 6th. And then Samir Gandesha, who's a professor from Simon Fraser, is going to be giving a talk on September 5th. So those are all upcoming. Hopefully, if things work out really well today, it won't be a problem trying to use the same format for those events in the future. So, as well as introducing generally about Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship and Rational Space, I just wanted to say a few words about Sinclair MacRae, who is going to be giving the talk today. I've known Sync, and I think Sync likes to be called Sync. I hope so, not Sinclair. I've known Sync for about 12 years at Mount Royal. I have great admiration for him as both a scholar and a person, a friend. And I think he has a number of very, very interesting ideas which should be made more widely available to people in Canada and around the world. And in terms of how he'd like to be introduced, he's been a philosophy professor at Mount Royal University since 1997. He does not own a distraction device. He tries to engage System 2 and use it well regularly, and he encourages his students to do likewise. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sinclair MacRae, who is going to give us his thoughts on In Defense of Reason, Creating a Climate for Academic Freedom. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Francis. Thanks, first of all, to everyone for joining us today. And thanks to Robert for his technical support and also for his organizing efforts. Thanks to Francis as well for her organizing efforts. Thanks to the people last week who helped us iron out the technical details. And thanks also to the Society of Academic Freedom and Scholarship and also Rational Space Network for sponsoring the talk. And thanks again to Francis for suggesting the idea. Originally, this was going to be a talk that I would have given at our PD retreat for our faculty association. I just modified it and just should say a few things. I'm going to switch to the PowerPoint slides. There we go. This is an unnatural format for me to deliver a talk. I'm more comfortable interacting with people and speaking without notes, but I've written some notes for today's talk because I begin with the assumption that people have not read the book. I apologize to the people who have read it. This might be, the review and summary might be a little bit boring. And the talk itself, I timed it out at around 40 minutes, so it's going to take a while to get through. I hope that the question and answer session afterwards will be a little bit smoother. So I'm just going to focus on the slides or present the slides for you while I go through the details and try to concentrate on what I want to say. So let's start with that. I think that's all I had to say to begin. So here's a picture of the book, a few details about it. The main part of the book is about 360 pages long, difficult in 40 minutes to present an overview of an argument that goes on for 360 pages, but I have written a summary of the argument, so I'll try to present that. Yeah, let me start. I'd like to begin by providing an overview of my talk and outline some goals for today. My presentation will take approximately, like I said, 40 minutes, and I'll provide an overview of the book's main argument and also some analysis, and some of the analysis applying to issues of academic freedom and scholarship. Some obvious starting questions are, why discuss a book published in 2014 and why Heath's Enlightenment 2.0? I admire the book for some reasons I'll explain, and since I think it deserves a wider audience, I'll be happy if my presentation and our discussion today helps to raise its profile and encourages you to read it if you've not already done so. Heath's reading is impressive, very wide, very deep. He exhibits impressive synthesizing ability in addition to excellent analytical skills. One of the greatest strengths of the book is his effort to integrate insights from so many different academic disciplines and fields of study, including psychology, sociology, social psychology, anthropology, criminology, economics, philosophy, he's a philosopher, evolutionary biology, cognitive science, behavioral economics, political theory, critical theory, decision theory, games theory, and on it goes. Consequently, one challenge and inevitable shortcoming in this approach is that it glosses over controversies and complexities within these fields, leading to the situation in which experts may take issue with one or more of his claims, which are sometimes drawn from other experts. I suspect this is simply one of the prices of the generalist program. It's odd to refer to Heath as a generalist, and by that I don't mean he's a generalist in the jack of all trades, master of none sense, because he has deep expertise as well, but he also himself doesn't claim to be an expert in all of the fields from which he draws his sources. So the main focus of Heath's argument, I think, is on trying to explain and promote conditions of a more just society realized through the advance of the Second Enlightenment. Here's the statement of the main goal. He says, suppose we wanted to advance the Enlightenment agenda of freeing humanity, not just the educated elite, but the mass of humanity from ignorance and superstition. This book outlines a program for a second Enlightenment, or Enlightenment 2.0. I interpret Heath's goal of promoting a second Enlightenment in order to free the mass of humanity from ignorance and superstition as not simply an attempt to promote reason or reasoning for its own sake, but for the sake of promoting our welfare or well-being. By promoting the exercise of good reasoning, we can live more authentically happy lives, lives in which we subject our particular values, goals, plans, standards, and expectations to critical scrutiny with an eye to independently justifying them. In other words, by becoming more enlightened, we can advance the project of autonomously endorsing our own value systems, a step necessary for liberating ourselves from living heteronymous lives, in which we're directed either by various outside forces, forces that result in brainwashing and groupthink, or interestingly, inside forces, namely the forces of intuition that serve our genes rather than us. More on this point later. Thus, I believe there's a deep connection between exercising reason and living a good life. Furthermore, since we're social beings and since Heath's focus is also on our living our lives in society, I read his support for a second Enlightenment as ultimately justified in large part by its promotion of our common good, understood as the constitution of the good of each of us in our larger organized groups. More precisely, I read the goal of advancing a second Enlightenment as promoting conditions of justice, which I understand roughly as the fair promotion of the common good, which in turn consists of the fair weighing of the interests of all those who are morally considerable. This means that if we imagine a second Enlightenment succeeding, that would be great, then insofar as it would fail to promote justice or the conditions of justice, then the argument for an Enlightenment 2.0 would fail. I'm introducing these qualifying points and starting assumptions in order to try to make the value of the project of Heath's book a little clearer, a little more developed, and a little more relatable. I'm also trying to anticipate and forestall some objections to his argument that I can imagine might arise. And I also want to draw a connection between the goals and projects of the book with the aims of academic freedom and scholarship, because I regard the principles and aims of academic freedom and scholarship as ultimately justified by the demands of ethics and justice. Thus, I will argue that there is an overlap between the goals of Enlightenment 2.0 as conceived by Heath and the defensible principles of academic freedom and scholarship. Here are a few more points and notes before we turn to the argument. Like I said, since the arguments developed over 360 pages, my overview will necessarily neglect much of the finer detail. This is regrettable because at one level, the book can be enjoyed just for its engaging discussion of a really impressive wealth of interesting examples and specific topics and analysis. This feature of the book is common to Heath's writing in general. I recommend all his books, actually, and his academic papers are excellent as well. Heath refers to many other thinkers, scholars, and researchers, but for the sake of fluidity, I'll mostly refer to him and his ideas throughout. Those of you interested in tracking down the more specific attributions and sources should consult the book. So here's an overview of the argument. I want to begin with this. The main argument begins with Heath's defense of the two minds hypothesis. According to this view, we have two control systems which frequently conflict in vying for control of our judgments and behavior. Historically, the dominant control system has been intuition, or system one. It's the product of evolutionary adaptation over, for our species anyway, a long time. In contrast, reason, or system two, is what biologists refer to as an acceptation. Basically, our capacity to reason is an accident that involves our using our primate brain in ways that it never evolved to do. He says that when you think of reason, don't think as the first Enlightenment thinkers did, of reason as a divine spark, as the pure perfection of our species, as represented by a heavenly angel. Think instead of it as the helicopter that a hobbyist might construct out of a bunch of old spare parts, each of which were designed for another purpose. As a result of the development and exercise of reason, we're now what biologists call an ultrasocial species. We've developed complex and interconnected systems of cooperation that have resulted in a shift from barbarism to civilization. System one is powerfully biased towards friends and family and strongly retaliatory towards others. Thus, although we evolved forms of cooperation prior to the advance of reason, these were limited in scope. So while it is true that humans are naturally suited for social life, it's false that we're naturally suited for the kind of social life that is normal for most of us now. Whereas biological evolution gave us barbarism, civilization is built on a set of strategies that have evolved, or been designed to overcome, the limitations of our tribal social instincts. Heath writes, perhaps the most fundamental insight that reason has to offer, the one that really allows us to rise up out of the muck and slime of our evolutionary prehistory, is that we have a powerful interest in cooperating with one another. There are many circumstances in which everyone can be made better off by having everyone exercise some restraint in the pursuit of their individual interests. Cooperation, therefore, involves setting aside one's self-interest in order to do one's part in promoting the collective interest. Just while I'm thinking about it, if anybody's interested in a copy of the slides, you can email me and I'll be happy to send them to you. However, one of the main problems with our attempts to uphold our newer, more complex systems of cooperation, resulting in such features of our life as the state, economic markets, and human rights, is that we've accomplished these advances in large measure by tricking ourselves into feeling as though we're still living in small-scale tribal societies, even when we're not. Unfortunately, these efforts are limited. They have so far proven to be maladapted for dealing with some of the complex cooperative challenges we face, such as halting and reversing the effects of global warming. They're also unstable and increasingly subject to exploitation. Over the past 150 years or so, various anti-rationalist forces in our society have evolved to exploit the fact that the environment in which our intuition evolved no longer obtains, and the heuristic or clue or workaround that evolved in system one that enabled us to flourish in the environment in which our intuition guided us misfire. They're increasingly subject to error and failure both for us and as individuals, and as groups. As our environments have become more unnatural from an evolutionary perspective, our attempts to maintain our more complex systems of cooperation built on reason become less and less successful. Part of the point in noting that reason is not natural, but rather an acceptation, is that it becomes, contrary to the view of the thinkers of the first Enlightenment, an open question whether this acceptation will survive, and now by extension, whether we will survive in such great numbers as an ultrasocial species, hence the need for a second Enlightenment. In this first longer part of the book, Heath explains and defends the two minds hypothesis and examines its implications for a second Enlightenment. According to this view, we have two sometimes conflicting and different control systems, only one of which is common to other animals and the product of evolutionary adaptation and development. And this is from Jonathan Evans. I define mind as a high-level cognitive system capable of representing the external world and acting upon it in order to serve the goals of the organism. The two minds hypothesis is that the human brain contains not one, but two parallel systems for doing this. Animals, according to this view, have but one system corresponding to the old mind in human beings. Humans have a second, new mind, which coexists in uneasy coalition with the first, sometimes coming into direct conflict with it. So how did the second system, reason, come about? Not via evolutionary adaptation. Heath argues that when one considers the domain-specific nature of evolutionary adaptation and development, but the domain-general nature of reason, along with its recent appearance, we're led to the conclusion that reason is an exaptation. For example, the evolution in animals from two-chambered hearts to four-chambered ones took place over the course of approximately 500 million years. Most generously, a similar time frame for the evolution of reason would be something like 250,000 years. Furthermore, most of the features of evolution are domain-specific, such as our ability to recognize faces, but not, say, individual trees. In contrast, reason is domain-general. Consider how this applies to mathematics. Heath argues that there appear to be two evolved traits or modules that we share with other primates: the ability to differentiate and name one, two, or three objects, and the ability to roughly discriminate between different piles or groups of objects. However, to think that we develop the capacity to reason mathematically in the same way requires a highly implausible supposition.
Sink, just to interrupt you for a sec, if you could just slow down a little bit because your sound is becoming a little muddied. That's just to give, yeah, just a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Francis. And yet, at the same time as nothing was going on in either of these two modules, which appear not to have changed over much over 5 million or so years, we somehow acquired from scratch a brand new module, which no other animal has, that allows us not only to count to infinity, but also to understand fractions, decimals, vectors, limits, negative numbers, irrational numbers, imaginary numbers, transcendental numbers, and much more. It makes no sense. The idea that we have one module for counting to 3 and another module for all the rest of mathematics, and that these came about through the same kind of natural selection, is completely unbelievable. The ability to do mathematics cannot have evolved in order to allow us to do mathematics. The fact that we acquired this ability must be a happy coincidence. The same argument can be generalized across other cognitive domains. There is simply no advantage to be had in building a single cognitive system that can be used to figure out the gravitational constant of the universe, build a machine to catch neutrinos, unlock the secrets of life on Earth, assess counterfactual probabilities, or think about what to serve for dinner next Thursday. These considerations lead Heath to a key conclusion of the two minds hypothesis, namely that our capacity to reason must be a byproduct of adaptations that were intended to achieve other goals. In other words, our primate brains aren't designed for rational thought. The rational part of the soul, far from being the pinnacle of creation, is actually just an accident, a strange little offshoot of an otherwise unpromising lineage. This analysis and argument continues, and it's very interesting, but let's press on with the larger argument. Heath examines the natures of and differences between these two systems. Some characteristics of system one. It's unconscious and automatic. Rapid, computationally powerful, and massively parallel. By massively parallel, he means that we can access different modules of system one at the same time. An example I use in class is I toss a marker across the room when my students aren't expecting it, and they immediately and automatically just follow the track of the marker. And you could also recognize somebody's face. In fact, it's very difficult not to recognize somebody's face that you know. And the point there is that it's unconscious, happens automatically. And one or more of these can happen at the same time. It's also associative and pragmatic, contextualizes problems in light of prior knowledge and beliefs, doesn't require the resources of working memory, and it's a low effort system as well. So he says intuition is very good at things like pattern recognition, tracking movement, remembering, building associations. On the other hand, intuition cannot count past 3, follow an argument with more than 2 steps, consider hypothetical states of affairs, think strategically, manage uncertainty, carry out a long-term plan, and solve collective action problems. You can think about our current situation with COVID-19 and how reason got us into this, and also how important it will be for helping to get us out of here as well. If we take a closer look at the nature of reason, we get these 5 characteristics. So first of all, reason requires explicit linguistic articulation, and as such, it can be fully explained and is potentially publicly presentable. Where reason and reasoning is transparent both to others and to the reasoner, intuition is opaque to us. Reason also requires decontextualization. Intuitive thinking relies upon contextual information, this is Keith now, to solve problems, often supplementing existing knowledge of the problem with additional information that might seem relevant. Rational thinking moves in exactly the opposite direction, stripping the problem of contextual details in order to get at elements of structure. In logic, we're interested in forms of reasoning, hence we study formal logic. The argument P implies Q, P, therefore Q, is logically valid. This means it's general rather than specific, and it has an infinite number of possible institution instances. Reason also uses working memory. This is Heath again. He says there's a very widespread consensus among cognitive scientists that rational thought processes depend crucially on this working memory system. And he gives an example of this, where he says that imagine a human is abducted by aliens, and the alien asks the human whether or not the human is rational. And the human says, yes, I am. And so the alien says, okay, well, can you tell me what 34 times 87 is? And the human says, well, can you give me a pencil and some paper? And the point that he's making is that we colonize elements of our environment in order to help our reason to function. And we're just not built to be able to use a lot of, or remember a lot of steps. And we have limited working memory, basically. What else? Also capable of hypothetical reasoning. The intuitive problem-solving system likes to work with facts. It's no good at handling supposition. Real world versus possible world thinking. Quote, this means that we need to use reason in order to engage in contingency planning, strategic thinking, and modal reasoning, and also deontic moral reasoning. The old mind, he says, as we have seen, lives in the present. It acts on the basis of what are called occurrent psychological states, things that you're feeling right now. One of the functions of rational thought is that it allows us to formulate and pursue long-term goals. And finally, it's hard and slow, and that means that it requires self-control and self-discipline. And that also means that has a number of implications for education. Sorry, I just noticed there's a request for me to admit someone to the meeting. Sorry about that. Sorry, Stan, if you were waiting. We could easily spend all of our time just talking about the natures of and differences between the two systems and the many, many implications these have for our lives. For example, one can make many interesting, insightful applications of Heath's analysis to our current situation. But for now, I just want to focus on explaining his argument and consider some applications of these deeper points to the argument for academic freedom and scholarship. So let's imagine Heath's case being presented in the form of a reply to a skeptic. Here's the skeptic's question. And then in response, we can say, there's a number of points we can make. First of all, intuition poorly served us previously when it did rule. Here's Heath on this one. Relying on our gut feelings and intuitions gave us 200,000 years of hand-to-mouth existence in hunter-gatherer societies riven by blood feuds, incessant tribal warfare, periodic famine, an average life expectancy of 30, and polygamous marriage based on what anthropologists now refer to euphemistically as wife capture. If we let the unconscious have its way, that's what we would get all over again. There's a reason that civilization collapses into barbarism and not the other way around. A second reason for why we shouldn't rely on intuition. Intuition is now even worse suited for helping us navigate in our world due to the innumerable ways in which the exercising of reason has changed our lives. Relying exclusively on intuition now would be very bad for us. However well intuition worked in the environment of evolutionary adaptation in which our species previously lived, as a result of the successes and advances made by exercising reason, many of these heuristics, or workarounds, are either ineffective or harmful to us now. Many of them have become cognitive biases, which we must consciously counteract. He cites a number of examples. The second section of the book explaining various aspects of our society in order to exploit our tendency to rely on intuitions in our lives. He gives examples from the history of advertising and also the development of politics. Here's just one example. We have all been in an environment in which sources of food that were rich in fat and sugar were rare, so the heuristic we were and continue to be guided by is eat as much of these types of food as you can. However, now rather than being rare, these foods are plentiful and pervasive. He notes that an average American eats 195 pounds of meat and 199 pounds of grain per year, but that they also consume 152 pounds of added sugar and 75 pounds of fat and oil. One problem with this is that whereas the pleasures of eating are immediate, the negative effects from poor eating habits mostly appear in the future. However, intuition has a present bias and is not even capable of representing, let alone thinking about future consequences. For that, we need system 2, and specifically, we now need to exercise a cognitive override to avoid the negative effects of a poor diet. Sorry, I've got another request to admit. Sorry, Corey, if you were waiting. For that, we need, sorry, there's a number of people. I think I should take a minute to make sure they all get back in or get in. For that, we need system 2, and specifically, we now need to exercise a cognitive override to avoid the negative effects of a poor diet. In other words, it's only by exercising reason that we can now hope to deal with this threat. And a third reason. We also cannot make changes to intuition to try to make it work better for us. Since intuitive cognition is unconscious and automatic, we don't know how it actually works. He gives the example of how we know how a computer works better than our own brain, and that whereas we process things are system 2 is a serial processor, whereas system 1 is my train of thought. Sorry, it involves parallel.
You're breaking up, Sync. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why, Sync. You're breaking up. I hope most people have their videos off, which might.
We can't.
Yeah, Sync is frozen for a moment.
Yeah. Connection is secure and connected. If
There's too many people here.
What can you do? Refresh it. I'm worried
You're talking over the phone. You're talking the phone overnight. Yes, you were talking the phone about how the Earth is changing because of our less traveling. Same thing.
I know, but it takes time. But how long have we been in this pandemic? They haven't thought about it since we started?
To make up.
Can people hear me?
Oops. Hello.
Yes.
I think Sync went off for a moment.
Hear you.
Yeah, we hear you loud and clear, Francis.
Okay, so you hear me, but just Sync, for some reason, I'm not sure what happened there. It just started to break up. Did Sync leave the meeting?
He's not on the meeting now. I've returned host to me, so
Okay.
he may have gone off for a moment to try to fix it. I don't know. He seems to have. This is the problem of technology. You never know what exactly is going to happen.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out as I was watching him what was making it kind of start to become a little bit garbled and what was making it more clear. And I think it was the way he was tilting his head with respect to the microphone. I wasn't sure about.
Yeah, that I agree. What happened at the end was completely different. So
yes. So hopefully he will he will return to. We've covered quite a lot of ground already in terms of grist for the mill of talking about current universities and so on. But hopefully, Sync will be coming back on. I'm not sure, Robert. What do you think we should do in the meantime? Just wait for Sync to come back on?
I don't know if it's possible to call him, but it would probably be good to find some way to contact.
Yep, I have his number, so I will. I'll just try and contact him, see what's happening, and so we'll be back in about 2 minutes or so, hopefully.
Okay, yeah. Just hold on, and we'll fix this. Okay, Sync is returned, I believe.
Yeah, sorry, I think my internet just cut out on me.
Technical issues that happen, I guess, in this era of internet and stuff. So do you want me to give you back the hosting?
Yeah, so I can share the slides again. Thanks, Robert.
Okay, just a moment here. Okay, here we go.
Thanks, Robert.
Should be good now.
Okay. Sorry for the delay, everyone. I didn't realize. I think the internet just cut out. Sorry, here we are. Number 4, intuition never developed service anyway. Rather, it developed to only directly serve our genes. We need to use reason in order to better directly advance our interests. And then even Keith Stanovich's words, the robot's rebellion. This is from the book. It's important never to forget when thinking about the unconscious that each of the modules that are employed by System 1 are cognition or adaptation designed to solve specific problems that arose in the ancestral environment. The fact that they are direct adaptations means that fundamentally they don't work for us, they work for our genes. Oh, more people are trying to get in. Hold on. They were selected because they helped our genes to leave behind more copies of themselves. This is why our unconscious has such an unhealthy interest in sex and violence, and why it is so relentlessly nepotistic and parochial. Reason being an adaptation is what allows us to achieve the robot's rebellion of formulating and pursuing our own goals and projects with some degree of independence from what our genes might like us to achieve. Consider the example of the so-called freedom protesters who are protesting the pandemic quarantine and stay-at-home orders. One of the ironies here is that those who protest in the so-called interests of freedom or for the sake of freedom are, insofar as they're controlled by their System 1 intuition, not being guided by System 2. And so I doubt that they're acting upon values that they autonomously endorse. These people are slaves to their own intuition. In their cases, their brainwashing is not simply due to external or heteronymous force acting upon them. It's due or also due to the internal heteronymous forces of their intuition. I realize that my argument here is overstated, but I think I could sharpen it and make it stronger. In any event, it makes the point about the robot rebellion, but
You're breaking up again, Sink. You're breaking up again, Sink. Sink, maybe you should just turn off your video for just about a minute or so, just when you're trying to talk. Like, it's good to see the screen for the slides, but I think your video might be taking up bandwidth for your internet connection. It might.
Okay, you can just shut off the video and keep the screen share on.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah.
So you should see yeah, I've done it. Yeah. Okay, hopefully that's gonna be solving the trick.
I think it is better now already.
Okay. Ask yourself, what sources of value should you pursue? I would argue that a life spent pursuing sources of welfare that require reason than ones that require intuition would be far more satisfying and meaningful. Another interesting implication of this distinction between us and our genes is that it reminds us that we often think about personal identity in quite careless ways. Later in part 3, Heath argues that due to its tendency to see association, we think in patterns, that System 1 is a natural stereotyper. So here's the next one. Our heuristic reasoning is powered by pattern recognition and association. When applied to social interaction, this makes us natural stereotypers. When we see people, we classify them automatically and without conscious thought. This primes us to remember certain things, feel certain ways, and expect certain actions. Although there are very good reasons for why we see the world in this way, many people are nonetheless mortified by this, or become mortified when they're shamed into thinking that they are really racist and bigots because they engage in quote unquote unconscious or implicit forms of bias based on people's physical characteristics. However, this is simply bad thinking. It rests on a failure to distinguish between being naturally ethnocentric and being a racist. The two are not the same. Heath writes, there's a long-standing debate about whether racism is something natural or whether it is taught. What has been demonstrated without a doubt is that the way people divide into groups, generating both heightened solidarity within the group and antagonism toward people outside the group, is about as innate as things get and is highly resistant to change. But this merely shows that we're naturally ethnocentric. That is simply the way the automatic processes of System 1 function. But natural ethnocentrism does not entail racism or bigotry. Whether one is a racist depends on whether they subscribe to racist beliefs. Although someone might lack self-awareness about the connections among their various beliefs, this sort of lack cannot consistently survive being brought out into the light. Thus someone might come to the realization of the following sort. I guess you're right, now that you mention it, the fact that I really think that Burgundians are naturally inferior does make me a bigot. However, that is not the same thing as being naturally ethnocentric. The fact that I must consciously override any tendency I might have to draw illicit inferences from my natural ethnocentrism does not show that I am an unconscious racist. It shows that I am not my System 1. I have achieved, in this area of my life at least, the robot rebellion. By the way, the notion that people are naturally racist makes little sense, apart from the fact that race is an obscure concept, as Heath observes. From an evolutionary perspective, why would people be racist? There were no different races in the environment of evolutionary adaptation, since there was no interaction between people from geographically distant populations. Moving on. We should not overstate the divide between intuition and reason. Heath argues that in one respect, the difference is a matter of degree. He argues that although our intuitive responses support cooperation in small-scale societies, these tribal social instincts include a retaliatory impulse that is counterproductive in larger scale systems of cooperation, where some free riding is unavoidable. So he says, when it comes to large scale cooperation, We humans have clearly exceeded our programming. We've become what biologists call an ultrasocial species, despite having a set of social instincts that are essentially tailored for managing life in a small-scale tribal society. So why then have we employed reason to develop ever more sophisticated forms of cooperation that require us to actively repress the impulses of heart and gut because of the benefits? He writes, perhaps the most fundamental insight that reason has to offer, the one that really allows us to rise up out of the muck and slime of our evolutionary prehistory, is that we have a powerful interest in cooperating with one another. There are many circumstances in which everyone can be made better off by having everyone exercise some restraint in the pursuit of their individual interests. Cooperation, therefore, involves setting aside one's self-interest in order to do one's part in promoting the collective interest. I think this point about the role of reason in solving collective action problems is one of the main insights of the book, and it's one that Heath has consistently explained and defended in his other published work. A very common feature of life is that we are constantly facing collective action problems. Heath's point is that we need to employ reason, typically manifested in the form of a formally or informally enforced rule or law, to help solve these problems to our collective benefit. Here's the basic structure of such a problem. So this is an example of a prisoner's dilemma. And you can see how, from the perspective of any particular person, the best outcome would be one in which they own a gun in order to protect their own safety, and everyone else does not own a gun. So for player one, that would be the cell on the upper right corner. Of course, if everybody thinks like that, then a race to the bottom problem is generated. And that means the outcome will be worse for everyone. The way to avoid the race to the bottom problem is for everyone to pursue a suboptimal outcome. And his argument is that we need reason to get there. Although not just reason, we do need reason to get there. And that's the state of affairs in which no one owns a gun. So bottom right-hand corner. So I've just taken one example, but you can use any number of other examples. Think about hoarding toilet paper or lining up to get out of a store. I mean, there are so many examples of the logic of taxation. The same thing applies. And sorry. He says, this is me paraphrasing. Although it might feel wrong, we're all better off living in a society in which there are fewer guns. However, one of the counterintuitive costs of this arrangement is that inevitably some people will illegally own guns. They'll free ride on the system. If you have a system of private property, there's going to be some theft. Thus, it takes the exercise of reason to see the costs of maintaining an opposition to private gun ownership in the face of these costs. These sorts of collective action problems are pervasive in our society, and his point is that in order to solve them to our general benefit, we need to exercise reason. Although they're unnatural, these more complex forms of cooperation allow us to enjoy many of the benefits of life in our society that we often take for granted. So he says, the state promotes cooperation not just by making and enforcing laws, but by exercising a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. It eliminates the disorder and chaos created by private vendettas and feuds by essentially denying individuals the right to private retaliation. If anything deserves to be called the bedrock principle of civilization, this is it. Indeed, one of the major developmental hurdles that societies must overcome in the transition from tribal to hierarchical societies. Even though very advanced systems of cooperation have been organized in tribal societies, there's a clear limit on the level of complexity they can achieve. All major world civilizations have developed only after the subordination of tribal loyalties into a broader, hierarchically organized state that claims a monopoly on the use of force. So how can we promote a second enlightenment, and what barriers and threats are there to this coming to pass? Okay, so given the potential benefits of using System 2, how can we promote a second enlightenment, and what barriers and threats are there to this happening? Consider this latter question first. Heath devotes the second part of the book to a fascinating examination of the many ways in which our culture has evolved to serve various special interests, motivated by such things as power, ignorance, and especially greed, by exploiting our outdated reliance on System 1. There's now a wealth of social science research in identifying not just the presentist bias I just mentioned, but many other cognitive biases that plague us due to their lack of fitness in the modern world. One of these is confirmation bias, which is the tendency to seek out evidence that confirms one's beliefs and to interpret experiences and recall past experiences in such a way as to also confirms one's prior beliefs. The tendency to avoid or discount evidence that undermines or disconfirms one's belief, and Heath refers to this as failing to think the negative. Chief among these is confirmation bias. Sorry, the next slide. He says, this failure to think the negative is somewhat exacerbated in our culture by a tendency to view genius as the ability to see connections that others don't. That's actually a better working definition of crazy than of genius. Seeing connections is easy. The human mind is wired to see connections and patterns everywhere, even where they don't exist. The trick lies not in seeing connections, but in throwing out ones that are no good. Einstein may have seen connections that others did not see, but he was also able to say with absolute precision what the testable consequences of his theory were, and most importantly, how that theory could be proven false. It was his ability to think the negative that made him a great scientist, not the ability to think different. Indeed, the central virtue of scientific education, as opposed to merely technical education, is the relentless focus on disproof. The scientific method forces us to do something that is, in fact, highly unnatural, which is to think about how we could be wrong, seek not just confirmation, but disconfirmation. Sorry. Although Heath references Einstein in this passage, the deeper point he emphasizes is that in order for reason to function well, we must regard it as not simply contained within the individual, but as a social construct and process. He argues that one of the failings of the first Enlightenment thinkers is that they viewed reason as part of or contained within the individual. This is a view based on a flawed understanding of reason as an acceptation. I'm reading again. The central weaknesses of reason are easily enumerated. It is slow, requires a lot of effort, and suffers from limited attention, a working memory bottleneck, and unreliable long-term memory. Unfortunately, we're easily lulled into thinking that reason is much more powerful than it is because we ignore all the environmental scaffolding and clues we've constructed over time in order to assist it in its operation. Indeed, if pressed to identify the one most powerful feature of human interaction with the environment, people often mention our ability to use tools, such as hammers and levers. The most powerful phenomenon, which typically goes unnoticed, is the way that we employ elements of our environment to augment our cognitive powers. The particular genius of the human brain, however, lies not in its onboard computational power, but rather in its ability to colonize elements of environment, transforming them into working parts of its cognitive and motivational system. Of course, these elements of our environment also include other people. Heath argues that in order for reason to function well, we should engage in it socially, as we see in the efficient functioning of the scientific method. One thing that's marvelous about the scientific method is that it is basically a methodological antidote to confirmation bias. And although it can function in this way by individuals thinking the negative on their own, there's plenty of evidence to support the view that this will most likely be successful if groups of individuals exercise their right to freedom of expression, their academic freedom rights to pursue their research and teaching in ways that they think is best, including most importantly by engaging in principled dissent. If we regard the truth, for instance, as a non-rivalrous good, your knowledge of the truth is consistent with me knowing the same truth, then we can best attain it by engaging in a vigorous questioning but principled conflict of ideas. As Heath puts it, as individuals, we have enormous difficulty seeing our own mistakes, much less the biases that lead us into them. People have a powerful inclination to think that biased thinking on their part would be detectable by conspicuous introspection. And unfortunately, the limits of introspection cannot be ascertained through introspection. Thus, the most powerful check that we have on our own tendency toward biased thinking is the willingness, perhaps even the eagerness of other people to correct us. For friends of a second enlightenment, academic freedom is an institutionalized way of promoting the sort of collective critical thinking that we can engage in to support the excellent functioning of reason. And I know I've gone on a while here. So I'm not sure if I should carry on with the last little bit, or if we should just have the talk now. Yeah, why don't I save these other remarks that I had, because that went on quite a while, and we can just have our chat now. Robert, do you want to take over the hosting function?
So hopefully that'll happen, and that might take a little bit of off of your system. So the idea now is that Robert hopefully is going to take over the hosting function. Oh, he's the host now. Robert's the host. So maybe hopefully say that removes your strain off your system. But the idea now is just to have a little bit of an exchange between Sync and me to get at some of the ideas of Heath. Unfortunately, I haven't read the book, which probably most other people haven't either, which is maybe helpful. But I was fascinated by your slides because it really brought forward to me some of the issues that we're facing at the university, as well as sort of more deeper philosophical and scientific questions about humanity and, to some extent, the evolution of humanity, I guess. And then the third kind of bridging point, which is actually an area of my own research, which is Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations, which does relate to the university because of indigenization, which is a major initiative now that exists in the university. So I guess in terms of just to summarize what I think Heath is probably saying is that humans are evolving, we're continuously evolving, and one of the major features of our evolution has been reason. Our capacity to reason, I think, is a major kind of, which is, to me, is something which I have accepted as part of my own understanding of human evolution. But I think this would be highly contested in the university, at least seems to me, with my colleagues arguing that there's other ways of knowing and so on that go on. And then secondly, the university, just to relate, I'm not sure if Heath goes into this, but it's certainly something that you've drawn out as an implication, that the university is one of our mechanisms that we're able to use to try to buttress our ability to reason. So the university can play an important role in having the kind of scaffolding, I think that's the word that Heath used, scaffolding, to encourage people within the university to set aside their initial mind or their intuitive types of processes and kind of, to some extent, get people to think a little bit more in terms of their second brain, which is the reasoning aspect. Is that generally your sense of what Heath is talking about, Sync?
That's right. The whole third part of the book is devoted to a discussion of ways in which we can alter what he calls the choice environment and promote reason as a social process. And it's an expression from Andy Clark, the idea of environmental scaffolding, or scaffolding that supports it. A good example of this is the classroom. So the idea of education, I mean, if you think in terms of our lives about the places in which we can promote the functioning of reason, given that it's slow, that it's very demanding. So at one point he says that some researchers suggested that we are bombarded with something like 5,000 requests or messages related to even advertising per day. It takes a lot of concentration and self-discipline. So if you translate that to the classroom is one of the few places in which we have institutional support for an environment in which people can collectively work together and reason without numerous distractions, assuming people don't have their distraction devices. And you can see also a community of scholars working together in the same sort of way to try to promote each other in terms of advancing their work by promoting conditions under which we can engage in principled dissent and discussion.
Yes.
So he says that what we want to do is try to take advantage of our misfiring heuristics to try to improve the social environment. And I didn't mention this, but at the end of the book, he argues for what he calls a manifesto of slow politics. And for him, the political process is corrupted. And the way to improve it is to basically introduce scaffolding that enables people to be more critical and engage in reasoning when they're talking about political questions.
Yes. So I guess I have a couple of questions then about those two different areas. On the one hand, the evolutionary character of humanity, and secondly, the university. with respect to the evolutionary character of humanity, I'm wondering what Heath's views are, the role that capitalism plays with respect to our ability to cooperate, the different interests that emerge, perhaps, like I'm just thinking from a historical materialist perspective, which is the idea of class conflict being a major problem in terms of trying to develop a cooperative system. Whether he has anything to say about that, or whether he thinks capitalism is actually plays a role in, to some extent, dragging us out of our tribal and feudal characteristics, because a lot of the things that we do see, things like markets, are to some extent counterintuitive. Originally it was personal relationships, if you look at anthropology in terms of economics, in hunter-gatherer societies. And then secondly, with respect to the university, some of the difficulties I think we're facing now, and I think actually Mark Mercer has mentioned this in some of his work, that we are, with the university, developing a culture of celebration as opposed to a culture of disputation. And I would imagine that Heath would see the culture of disputation as being one of the major areas of scaffolding that we can use to sort of develop our reasoning capacities. And then we see a whole bunch of different things happening at the university where we're in fact encouraged not to use reason. And I think, well, I just mentioned indigenization as being one of those areas, but there's a whole bunch of other things where we're, and you've mentioned it yourself in your own work about respecting people and so on, where, you're kind of told at the university, don't really be someone who disputes what's being put forward. You should really be celebrating various cultures. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on those two areas.
I'll try and be brief. First of all, in this book, he doesn't speak as much as he does in his other work about the economic functioning of a market, capitalism. So I recommend reading Filthy Lucre if you want to take a look at that. And also, I came across Heath, I don't know, at least 12 years ago, I think more than that, because I was interested in business ethics. And he's famous in business ethics for defending what's called a Paretian, or a market failures approach to understanding business ethics. So I think if you read, he's got a collection of papers, but that they were all published in various journals. I think all of them were. Recommend that, and looking into the market failures approach to business ethics. So he argues that if you look into economics, for example, both on the left and right in the political sphere, people are mistaken in their views about economics in ways that undermine their understanding of how a market economy impacts our lives and so on. So that's a good place to look for that. The second point that you raised, I distinguish between, well, first of all, I think of education itself as a political act. And the political act can be promoting reason in the way in which we encourage our students to learn to think well for themselves and to care about things that should matter to them. But you can contrast that with the kind of perversion of reason in the university setting, which I've seen and find quite alarming, which I think of in terms of a politics of activism. So this is obviously a gross dichotomy. But Heath argues in the book that one of the problems with the Tea Party, for example, in the United States, is that their slogans were their policies. So if you appeal to gut or to heart or system one, then just by the nature of that system, there's really no room for any kind of rational discourse. And the problem, he says, with the Occupy Wall Street movement was that they had good slogans, but the slogans that you can put onto a poster don't really help with regulating the securities industry. In other words, if you're going to deal with complex problems in a market economy or in a state, you're going to have to get into the nitty-gritty details of policy as well. So if we're encouraging our students to engage in what I call this politics of activism without the background of investigating the ideas, which is what I'm calling the politics of education, then you see, unfortunately, in many cases, the perversion of reason in the university setting. So just to wrap up, yeah, obviously I'm very much supportive of the idea of an environment of disputation, because it's only through this collective this collective exercising of reason that we can make really useful progress in society. And I think that that doesn't support this politics of activism, which often is dismissive or doesn't even consider any kind of dissent.
So just one final question before we open it up to the audience. One thing that was occurring to me as you were discussing things about the history of the Enlightenment and so on is the role that postmodernism has played in really thwarting Enlightenment principles. And for people who are unaware of what exactly postmodernism is, it's a relativist, well, from an epistemological standpoint, how we know things. It's a relativistic position, which I think has really contaminated the humanities and the social sciences to quite a large degree in many universities. Does Heath have anything to say about that and why this all has happened? Is this just a kind of a reinvention of romanticism that used to exist at the time of the first Enlightenment 1.0? Is this something else? Does he have anything to say about that in his book?
Yeah, so he has a background in critical theory. He has quite a bit to say. He also has a blog entry on this. If you want to look it up through the U of T, you can see it. It's quite good. He talks about, the phrase he uses is a left-wing academic echo chamber. There's an analysis, I didn't stress this in my overview, but one of the concerns that he has is the forces of anti-rationalism in our society. So he identifies problems on the right and on the left. So with conservatives, he distinguishes between Edmund Burke's kind of conservatism, which was focused on the idea, he cites Hegel's example of the remark, the real is the rational. The idea that you can't, part of the arrogance of the first Enlightenment was the idea that you could just build from scratch a complex system. So complex and political system is one that's going to have many checks and balances. He gives the example in construction, or he says that you couldn't have the smartest team of engineers in the world build an Airbus A380 from scratch. It's a kind of a cultural evolution or evolution, descent with modification that's intentional. So it's a cumulative growth of understanding over time that you can't get just from scratch. That's part of the hubris, or I guess arrogance of the idea of the power of reason just moving from scratch. And he says that he distinguishes conservatism from this Burkean perspective with conservatism as it's morphed into this appeal to the gut. So an example he uses is the shift in conservative politics in Canada from 1991 and Mulroney's championing of the GST tax, which was a value-added tax, which the Conservative Party appealed to experts in economics to argue for the rationality of the tax. And he contrasted that with the Harper's conservatives in 2005 or 6, I forget, who basically just wanted people to associate the Conservative Party with anti-taxing, which is obviously inconsistent with supporting the goods of public goods through government. So that shift in conservatism he sees as one of the forces of anti-rationalism. On the left, to finally get back to your question, he argues that there have been a number of occasions where people on the left have confused technical rationality, which they associate with things like the atomic bomb, with an attack on reason in general. And he argues that one of the problems with feminism, for example, is that it's often in danger of slipping into conspiracy theorizing, just crazy stuff, because he says there's no skeptic in the back of the room saying, why should we believe any of this? So that's another force of anti-rationalism, and he makes the same argument in the case of postmodernism and post-structuralism as well. So in the blog entry, if you want to look it up, he argues that, he says that he was invited to review a number of books, and they're filled with jargon, and they don't have actually any basis. And his supposition is that he cites the example of Habermas accusing Foucault of being, what does he call it, a crypto-normativity. In other words, of refusing to engage in any kind of discussion of his metaethical assumptions about his own view. And I've experienced this in my own academic career when I've read jargon from profs in different fields and then asked them about the jargon, and they can't really explain it. So if you're not a member of the club, you get what he calls as a left-wing academic echo chamber. So That's another force of anti-rationalism in our society, and it's disturbing, obviously, because it's in the university as well. And the third force of anti-rationalism, he says, is the stream among psychologists who argue that we really can't reason because of the pervasive number of cognitive biases that prevent us from actually engaging in reason. So I think he has a fairly pessimistic view of the possibilities of overcoming all these forces. I see education as optimistic, as a hope. I'll stop there.
Okay, I think that we've had enough time for interaction. What I'm going to do now then is I'm going to turn it over to Robert Thomas, the host. We're going to open it up to the audience. People who would like to ask Sync a question, if there's a chat button, it's about in the middle of your screen, on the bottom of your screen. If you just move your cursor down, for people who are not familiar with this program, you'll see a chat button. If you just press on that, you can type in your question. And what's going to happen is that's going to go to Robert. And then Robert will take a look at the questions. And when Robert selects, because there might be repetitive questions and so on, he will ask you to ask your question. And then you can turn on your video and ask the question of Sync and then have an interaction with Sync about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francis and Sync. So we're going to, I have a list of people to ask questions. So you're welcome to either just use the microphone if you prefer that, or you can turn on your video. I'll make sure I give each of you permission. Where do we go here? I'll make sure I give each of you permission to do so. The first question is from Bruce Party. If you'd like to ask your question.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks, Sync. That was really interesting. I appreciate that. My question, I think, I'd like to push you along a little bit more along the path that you were going with that most recent answer that you gave to Francis. And in a sense, I'd like to be a skeptic of Heath and say that his critique may be fair enough, but his prescription has a lot of problems in this sense. Does it not contain an inherent contradiction in the sense that he is advocating collective action in the common good, but reasoning is something that individuals do? Any program undertaken in the common good is one that puts aside the reasoning of individuals in favor of someone's particular view of what the common good consists of, like Heath himself. I hate to use labels, but he comes across to me as a collectivist, and he is ignoring the location where reasoning happens, which is in the mind of the individual. And he strikes me as fundamentally not self-aware. I mean, he thinks he's rational, and those other people are irrational. But morality itself is an irrational, intuitive, emotional process. I mean, nobody can prove the correctness of a moral proposition. It just can't be done. It's not the kind of thing it is. So he strikes me as subject to his own confirmation biases, his own self-image, his own emotional, intuitive responses. Academic freedom is not a collective thing. Reason is not a collective activity. My take is that the first problem is not the lack of rationality, it's the lack of individualism. And as soon as you start going down the collective route, you run into the same problem that we have right now, which is irrationality at the collective level, and people insisting upon that the group must be right and you're not allowed to think differently than the group. If you start with individualism, then you might get rationality or you might not, but after all, it's a free country and people are going to be right whether they're rational or not. What do you think?
Thanks for the question, first of all, Bruce. I didn't, in the closing remarks I was going to make, I made a distinction that's relevant now. So you can distinguish between the functioning of the control module of reason, system 2, and you can distinguish between that, and you can think of a spectrum of reasoning being good or bad, poor. You can reason well or you can reason poorly. So it's all along that spectrum. So the argument that he wants to make is, sorry, there's one other distinction. The other distinction here is that you can employ reason to good or bad ends as well. So you can employ reason to promote justice or not. So to respond to the first part of your question, you can distinguish between the functioning of system 2, reason, and its good functioning. And his argument is that given the scaffolding and given the nature of good reasoning, it's something that is better done collectively. So although it's true that the module functions within each of us, the idea is that we colonize elements of our environment in order for it to function better, and part of that colonizing includes the work of other individuals.
Could I just interrupt you there, though?
Go ahead.
Yeah, but even that notion, though, that reasoning can produce good or bad is a collective notion, right? Sure. He's taking upon himself the job, the paternalistic job of giving judgment about whether outcomes are good or bad in the collective interest. Right. And that is essentially a collectivist point of view. It's one that says, well, I have the insight to tell you whether or not this outcome is good or bad and whether or not we should change it, as opposed to the individualistic approach which says, do what you want, people, think about it yourself, be irrational or not my business.
So yeah, I think we're not going to have enough time, but I reject the sort of non-cognitivist view of morality that you're painting. The argument for that, though, would take me a lot of time. I don't mean to not be able to engage you in that discussion, but I'm going to say something different instead, which is if you look around your environment right now, practically none of that environment is the product of any particular individual. In other words, it's only as a result of our ability to cooperate, including transgenerationally, that we are able to enjoy any kind of quality of life. So any argument for individualism has to be prefaced by an appreciation of the extent to which our welfare depends upon our operation in the context of the society in which we operate. And the point that he's making about collective action problems is that, as a matter of fact, we are doomed to participate in race to the bottom problems if we fail to appreciate the extent to which our welfare depends upon our willingness to agree to cooperate with others for all kinds of basic things that make our lives go well. I'll just give you a really quick sort of insight into the point about the non-cognitivism and the idea that individualism is hopelessly subjective. If you think about what makes life go well, I would argue that the best sources of welfare are ones that, even though it's true, I think that happiness is overdetermined for humans, the best sources of welfare are ones that help us connect up with others. Like, for example, the idea of living a meaningful life. The main element of that, I think, is the extent to which we promote the good of others. So that's not very much of an argument, but that's the path that I would go down if I wanted to try to defend the idea that individual good depends upon the good of others. I probably shouldn't let other people have a chance.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Bruce. So our second question, I will try to get to everyone in a moment. Our second question is from Christopher Colum, and he's requested that I ask his question for him, so I will do that. How should elementary and secondary students be taught to at least discriminate between reason and their observational biases? I don't recall much of that when I was in high school during the 1980s. So go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, Christopher, thanks for your question. So my view about education is that, so this is me, I'm not sure what Heath would have to say about that. I can only guess. But my view about education is that the longer you go on, the less teachers should be needed. So I think of the value primarily of education as fostering the development of self and other regarding virtues. And among that group of virtues are virtues such as developing a good work ethic, having self-discipline, resilience, persistence, determination, curiosity, skepticism. These self-regarding virtues are what we cultivate through our successful attendance at school, and all of them support good exercising of reason. Although you can study to be a better reasoner. I teach informal and formal logic. You can also gain the ability to think well as a result of cultivating those self-regarding virtues. So I think actually just sitting quietly at your desk and trying things. He talks about education in the book. For example, he says that environment, the idea that education should always be dazzling or entertaining or exciting, speaks against the notion that reason is hard and slow. And we need to cultivate the ability to be able to concentrate for extended periods of time. And so I think, I guess indirectly, you can improve your ability to reason by practicing that. I'll stop there and give somebody else a chance.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Paul and Miriam. If you could come on and ask. There we go. Go ahead.
I think, yeah, thanks a lot for making me think on a Saturday. So I was just wondering if the book addresses, or if you have thoughts yourself, around the argument, could it be rightly argued that existential threat does and should triumph reason and hence limit academic freedom? So an example would be Suzuki's call for the jailing of so-called climate deniers, which would include people, of course, like, Nobel Prize winning Freeman Dyson. But there are people that argue that this should supplant academic freedom because there's, sort of a higher principle here, an existential one.
Thanks, Paul. Was that it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Paul. That actually brings up, I'm just going to turn your question around a little bit and raise a puzzle. Hi, Miriam. That I think raises a question about the extent or the justification of principles of academic freedom and scholarship. So the example I use is the example of using opportunities at universities, say, to learn how to exploit people's cognitive biases and then teaching your students how to do that. So for example, there are books that have been written on how to game the rules in business law, for example. So you can teach people, what's that guy's name? Martin Scarelli is an example of someone who bought up patents in pharmacies, in the area of pharmaceuticals, and then exploited basic market failures there. Should people be free to pursue lines of research that might reveal the truth, but that are inconsistent with the pursuit of justice, which is, I think, the point that you're getting at as well. So I'd be interested in hearing what people have to say about whether they think that principles of academic freedom and scholarship are would justify pursuing the truth at the expense, but possibly of justice. So I can think of people arguing, like I'm thinking of Mill, for example, and on liberty, arguing that you're not going to know how good some view is unless you're exposed to criticism of it. But there's a difference between knowing the truth about something and teaching people how to game the system or exploit people's failures. Think about behavioral economics, for example. Dan Ariely has written a number of books on behavioral economics, and you can use that information to basically take advantage of other people. Should people be free to do that? And maybe I'll stop there and I'll give other people a chance.
Thank you very much. Okay, the next question comes from Trevor Thomas. You want to?
Hi there, just a quick question. Actually, first I just want to say I agree with, going back, I agree with Bruce on what he said about individualism versus collectivism. And I think there are individualistic systems in place that do benefit the collective good. It's called capitalism and it works really well. But anyhow, so with that, I'm a so-called conservative academic here at the University of Regina early in my career. And I've been told to keep quiet about what I see as creeping identity politics, especially in the Canadian university system. I'm American, so it's kind of culture shock to me a bit. So what advice or resources do you have for scholars like myself? That's my question.
Sorry, I just had to unmute. Thanks, Trevor. I have to think about your question to give you a good answer. Off the top of my head, I would encourage you to read this book as a place to go. And the one thing I didn't mention about the book is, although the argument's about 360 pages, the book is another 60 or so pages. So there's a huge number of references, and there's lots of great things to dive into. So this isn't very satisfying on the spot, but I don't really have a good answer. I just think it's something I need to think a bit more about to give you an answer. Maybe others have some ideas. Sorry about that, Trevor. Hang in there, though.
No problem. I really just appreciate somebody that's willing to listen to or even entertain the idea that you don't necessarily have to be on the radical leftist side of academia in order to survive. And it's become kind of scary, honestly. And I'm not trying to play victim because I'm not, but it's something that I do frequently get nervous about, especially when not only are these policies creeping into like the curriculum, but they're beginning to creep into how we may or may not conduct ourselves in the classroom. At the University of Regina, we have indigenization, for example. You're not allowed to criticize it. You're not allowed to question it. And not only that, but you're being encouraged actively to include it into your curriculum. And that flies absolutely in the face of academic freedom, I would argue. Yeah, and I don't know, have you heard of the George Eliot Clark incident that we had here at the U of R? Yeah, so I'll just let that stand where it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trevor. I should mention that the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship has quite a diverse set of political views from our membership that goes somewhere between Marxist and somewhere right of center. So I always enjoy our meetings because I feel more sane than being around the usual people at the university. Oh, I shouldn't say that, University of Regina. Anyways, thank you very much for your question. I don't know if Carlos Videla would like to ask a question.
Hello. I lost already my train of thought because I was paying attention to all of these very interesting conversations. But I think, what I wanted to say was something to a comment of Bruce, or I mean, maybe I already got it wrong, but there was something that he was saying that reasoning takes place inside the individual, or is not collective, or something like that, or just a little comment. In the very narrow world that I live, which is mathematics, how does reasoning operate there? So it's actually a mixture of the both things. So he's right, and at the same time partially wrong, I think. When an individual mathematician is facing a problem, well, it's just basically you against the problem. So it's a tremendously individual effort of concentration and loneliness, let's put it this way. Properly speaking, I don't know what mental processes you would describe there as reasoning, but most of the time it's hard work until you see kind of a flash of a solution. So that's kind of an intuition. Let's use that word. You make little drawings on a piece of paper, you sleep, and maybe many years later, bah, something occurs. That process I wouldn't describe as reasoning. It's just something. I mean, of course, it's an effort, right? But then when you write down your intuition, let's say, it has to be a proof. So it has to fit into a certain canon that a society of mathematicians will recognize as correct. And that is communal. I mean, if Einstein just simply said blah, 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 and there was no communality as to what is this guy talking about and what are his proofs or whatever, then he would have been like a madman, just walking around saying stuff, right? So there's these two things. I mean, when I write down a proof, I I owe to generations and generations of humans from 10,000 years ago that evolved a certain language and logic and whatnot, and proof systems, and I cast my thought, the discovery that I made individually through hard work. So that is reason inside mathematics, let's say. So it's kind of yes, it's individual, terribly individual, but finally, when you write down your argument, it is a shared language, it's a shared thing. And actually, when we send a manuscript to a journal, we really want the other humans to read it and certify that your proof is correct. Otherwise, our silly deans would deem that it's a paper, but it's not in a referee journal, right? So that's a communal thing, right? Anyway, there's other comments that I would like to say, but I think it's a great topic, Sinclair and everybody else. That's all.
Thanks, Carlos. Robert, are you there? I think you. Oh.
And Robert, if I could just interrupt for a second.
Yes.
I've just tried to send you something through the chat, and it says Robert is not in the meeting, so I'm not quite sure if anyone else is having that problem.
I'm still in the meeting, really. I'm here. The last message I received was a minute ago. Oh, we do have one question from, sir, I don't know what is your name?
Miriam, you had it. Oh, no,
okay.
no.
Oh, sorry. No, I had there. Let me. Oh, sorry, Henry. Yes. I knew you, but I couldn't. I think we've maybe interacted once. Do you want to ask a question for Sync? Okay. Yeah. Good.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I'd just like to say thanks for the talk and also for the questions. I found I was very pleased to hear Bruce's comments and also Trevor, because I agree a lot more with them. And I guess I don't know if this is a question or a comment. I guess three of the things, maybe even 4 points that you raised was, for example, the global warming. And then also you mentioned the quarantine, that people who were against the lockdown, you considered them to be selfish. And I think maybe that sort of highlights the point. I mean, people can discuss this and there's so many discussions going on how the lockdown does much more damage than if there wasn't the lockdown. So I think that's sort of, and the same thing with global warming. I mean, this is really a lot of scientists discussing things on both sides. And I think the fact that this person is writing a book and just assuming that one side is correct and the other side is selfish, I think that sort of really raises a question. I think the main point is that there should be discussion and rationality on both sides. It's very hard to decide who is correct very often. So there was those 2 things, and I guess another point was this statement, unhealthy interest in sex. Not sure what that means. So it sounds like it's sort of related to the same point. I hope that's clear.
Good. Thanks. Oops, sorry. Okay. Well, thanks, Henry. I just wanted to mention a couple of things in response. Thanks for your question. The analysis about the current pandemic situation postdates the publication of the book, so it's just my analysis. And so that's not Heath that's speaking. And the point that I was making is that in order to in order to defend your behavior from a reasons perspective or a system 2 perspective, you have to be able to cite reasons in support of whatever it is you're doing. So I was only focusing on the selection of the protesters who are acting out of intuition as opposed to reason, which is ironic given that they're claiming that they're supporting freedom as well. And that's also the last point you made. It's the same thing as well. So I think it's one of the interesting things in the book, I think, is that we can draw a distinction between our interests, our identity, and the interests of our system 1 functioning. And the idea of a robot's rebellion is that we don't have to think of the interests of our system 1 as the same as our interests. So I would argue that our interests can be the ones that we can autonomously endorse, sometimes at the expense of whatever our intuition tells us. I'm going to stop there and give you a chance to respond, or somebody else a chance to speak.
I'm sorry, I seem to be getting disconnected at times. I didn't hear all of that, but I got most of it.
Thank you very much, Henry, for your question. I don't know if there's any. There appears to be no other questions. Is
I
there
just
anyone
want to ask
else?
a question. For some reason, I'm not sure if there's other people. If other people want to ask a question, like I had a question in the chat, but I can't. Every time I try and send it, it tells me that Robert Thomas is not in the meeting. So I don't
Yeah,
know.
you should send it to the host. So
But I can't seem to change it. I have no kind of chevron or anything to change it to everyone, or like it just has Robert Thomas. That's the default. It won't allow me to do anything. But I'll just ask the question to Sync anyway, since I think this is kind of a sort of at the heart of the disagreement that people have about all these issues. I think everyone on this call is to, I assume, everyone's in agreement that freedom of expression, open inquiry, academic freedom, this should be maximized, I think, is generally the sense. And myself, I come at it from a historical materialist perspective, which is rooted in the theories of Karl Marx and the labor theory of value, which of course makes me and Henry and Trevor and Bruce probably have significant differences about things. But I'm open. Like I don't want to close off my thoughts about these things because I could be wrong. I have to realize I could be wrong on these matters, and I tend to get really slightly mentally disoriented when I think about these interesting questions that Sync raises about philosophy and justification of one's position. But I think one of the questions that we would probably disagree upon is, to what extent does capitalism encourage or discourage reason? That's kind of, I think, an essential question. And Trevor and Bruce and Henry, I think, would say that it's like it is the force that drives reason, or it enables reason because of competition and markets and so on. Whereas historical materialism would say that capitalism, because of its exploitive character, its fundamentally exploitive character, discourages reason so as to prevent people from understanding its exploitative nature. And I was just wondering if you had thought about that, Sync, or if you could comment on that.
Thanks, Francis. Yeah, those are very big topics. I can say a little bit about Heath's view, and maybe say a little bit about my own as well. So Heath argues that fundamentally markets are, they function when they function well to satisfy people's desires. And that in order for market economy to function, it has to be the case that there's either ethical or legal norms that are both actually, that are operating in order to ensure more efficiencies in those markets. And the three ways in which markets fail is through monopolization or cartelization, through information asymmetries. For example, if I try to sell you a car and I adjust the odometer on the car to indicate that it hasn't gone that it's gone 100,000 kilometers less than it actually has, then that's going to cause a problem in the economic exchange that we engage in. And the third one is the problem of negative externalities. So he argues that in order for economic markets to function well, those market deficiencies have to be addressed either through ethics or law or both, typically. But another point that he makes in relation to this is the idea that in order for markets to function properly, there has to be an integration between the markets and the state. So he gives an example in the 19th century of the history of legal advances that made business much more reliable, commerce much more reliable, that involved interference on the part of the state, such things as deposit insurance, for example. So his view is fairly nuanced and sophisticated, I think, as well. And I think that I think you raised questions that are deep. The one point that I would add is that merely having your preferences satisfied doesn't make your life go better necessarily. So I distinguish between having your preferences satisfied and being able to autonomously or authentically endorse the preferences that you want to have satisfied. So that's the tricky part, I think, or one of the tricky parts. So merely living in an economy where you can have your preferences satisfied, if they're just preferences that speak primarily to your system one, isn't going to necessarily lead you to, probably won't lead you to living your best life. So I really do think that there are differences between the kinds of sources of intrinsic value that we can get. So for example, you can distinguish between pleasure as an intrinsically good thing and the idea of leading a meaningful life or pursuing knowledge for its own sake. I think that here I would say that some kinds of intrinsic sources of welfare are subject to hedonic adaptation and others are not. And the ones that are not, such things as self-acceptance, being connected to other people, pursuing knowledge, those things lead to I would argue it's tricky, but I would argue a better life for individuals. What makes it tricky is that we're different, I believe, as well. Anyways, yeah. Big topic.
Yes, and I think I see it a little bit like there's a kind of a superficial kind of aspect, which is the role that advertising plays, for example, in accumulating profits, maximizing profits, and so advertisers try to discourage rationality to some extent and appeal to the emotions so that they can sell more products. That's kind of the superficial sort of side of it. And then the more fundamental one, though, is all the nature of ownership kind of relations that exist and how, like, markets, although it's true that supply and demand and satisfying our preferences and how that links into individualism, I understand the role that that's played, and to some extent in increasing the rationality of the system, because it's dragged us away from our tribalistic kinds of characteristics. But then on the other hand, in order for markets to function, and the whole nature of capitalism in terms of ownership, like property rights, preventing people from accessing the resources that they need, I sort of wonder, and I haven't figured this out entirely, I just know that there's serious structural problems within the system in terms of satisfying human need just because of property types of relations. And I'm sure this is a point of disagreement that I have with Bruce and Henry and Trevor, but I'm quite interested in the arguments, and it disturbs me that we don't have these arguments in the academy anymore. Like it's all been taken over by what I don't know really the right word to describe these people, but identity politics people type of thing who just sort of say these discussions shouldn't happen anymore in the university because we're right, and if we had these discussions it would make some marginalized group feel uncomfortable, and that's the end of the discussion. So I think that's sort of the difficulty of the university these days.
I just wanted to interject that both Bruce and Trevor wanted to chime in. So I don't know how you want to handle that, Sync, if you wanted to speak to Francis's point, and then I'll leave that to you.
Thanks. I'll just try and be brief in responding. Heath has a long discussion in the second part of the book about the ways in which advertising has evolved or devolved, I guess, to be primarily focused on manipulation. And this relates to the question about freedom that Francis was raising. He argues for something he calls nudge paternalism, which is that we can take advantage of our cognitive misfires in order to encourage people to make more rational choices. But I think the deeper issue there is how we conceive of people as adults, basically. I mean, my own view is that if you think of the idea of being an adult evaluatively, that many people, despite the number of trips around the sun they've taken, don't qualify as adults. And the reason why that's relevant is because you can make an argument that we're justified in interfering with the choices that people who are incompetent make in the interest of promoting their own good. And an interesting thing to think about is the extent to which we would be justified in interfering with the freedom of those who satisfy the criteria of being an adult in terms of the number of trips around the sun they've taken, but not in terms of their ability to justify their own value system. So anyways, that's just an interjection. Again, I encourage you to read part 2 of the book if you're interested. I'll turn it over to whoever wants to go next. But in other words, I'm sending it back to you, Robert. You have to make an edit.
Okay, maybe Bruce can talk next, because he had requested first. Then if Trevor wanted to speak to this specific point,
Yes.
he can do that. And then we have another question from let me just go from Yuhuan. But that we'll go in that order.
Thanks, Robert. I just wanted to speak to this point as well, because I think this underlines the difference between these two worldviews very well. The question about what the good life consists of. And Heath's point seems to be, like so many other collective thinkers, is that it's something that we can make a judgment about. But what the good life consists of is a matter for the individual to decide. Always, always, always. Somebody who inserts himself and says, oh, no, your decisions, your wants, your preferences are irrational. We can't allow that. Well, that person is making his own individual assessment and applying his own individual preferences about what good consists of. It is paternalistic. It is inherently contradictory. Thinking can only happen inside your own brain. Now, I'm not saying that cooperation doesn't happen and influence doesn't happen. Of course it does. That's the nature of being human. But thinking happens in brains, and brains are contained in individual people. People do not have to be rational in order for their wants to be their own wants, and for them to have a right to have nobody else interfere. Advertising notwithstanding. Advertising is fair game. You're trying to influence people's preferences. People do that to each other all the time. There's nothing wrong about that. And if people come to preferences that you don't like, well, too bad for you, because it's not your life, it's their life. Markets don't fail. Market failure is a term for outcomes that you don't like. I'll leave it there.
Should I go?
Bruce, oh, sorry, go Trevor. Go ahead, Trevor.
Yeah, go ahead, Trevor. Sorry.
I just wanted to answer one thing. You said, Francis, I believe. Is that how you pronounce your name? Okay, sorry. You asked the question, do markets maximize reason? And I would say, well, no, they don't. That's not what they're there for. Markets are there to maximize profit, and they're there to distribute resources with the least amount of, death, infighting, that sort of stuff as possible. Now, if you want to go with a rationalist system, you look at, say, central planning. But the problem with central planning in like socialist sort of ways, communist, socialist sort of, Marxist sort of ways of distributing wealth is that they always have resulted in not the good life, the opposite of the good life: starvation, privation, repression, death. I mean, the most deadly dictator in the history of history was not Hitler, it was Mao, and nobody ever says that. That's actually one thing that really bothers me about the discourse at universities, is that nobody says that. There are socialist groups on campus who espouse Mao. It's like, well, okay, what if I started up a Nazi group on campus? Not that I want to do something like that. I mean, Hitler killed fewer people and he hated less people. He hated only a certain group of people, whereas Mao hated an entire broad class of people. So point is, backing up, capitalism is not there to maximize reason. It's not its job. It is there to distribute in the most efficient way possible, distribute wealth. And yes, there are inequalities.
I have to interrupt you there because
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's not really what I was, and Johan should be given a chance to speak too, because she hasn't spoken.
Yeah,
yet. I just wanted to say, I was just talking about capitalism as a general economic system, and it's dragging us out of feudalism and putting in place markets which are a different kind of system than personal exchanges, which are in tribal societies, which sort of, I wasn't really trying to get at sort of the specific level that you're talking about.
Yeah, I guess that was a long way of saying that I agree with you that and that capitalism doesn't maximize reason, and that's not its job.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Moving along, is Huan here available? Do you want to talk? Okay, good.
Okay. I kind of regret that I put my name there because not even questions, and my thinking is not nearly as deep as what has been going on. But I was just, this is fascinating to me. My brain is just running all over the place. Not that I have very much left, my brain, I mean. So I was just wondering, can the basis of a reason be the same throughout humanity? I mean, what are the basis of reasoning? I'm also wondering if reasoning, if environment, be it physical or culture, influence how people deploy their cognitive, abilities. And if human experience comes into play, is it possible that any reason could be seen, it could be perceived as a prejudice, by some people? I mean, do we have an ultimate form or model of reason? I mean, is there one way, or I'm just thinking if human experience is even partially the base of a reason, then we cannot possibly have the reason. I don't think I'm making sense.
Thanks, Yuan. Am I interrupting?
No, I'm done. I'm just thinking aloud, I think.
Right. So maybe I could take that. I didn't very clearly distinguish between the idea of employing the faculty of reason and making judgments about what constitutes good or bad reasoning. So you can do that purely formally in terms of whether, for example, a deductive argument is valid or not. But when you make assessments of reason with respect to human life, you're always going to be doing that relative to some evaluative standard. And this is one thing that makes the whole story complicated, in that we have different evaluative standards. Like, for example, I believe our lives can go well in different kinds of ways. So we have to distinguish between the sort of technical reason or the functioning or instrumental rationality and the judgments we make about how we use our reason to make our lives go better or worse. That's where the evaluative point comes in. I just wanted to respond really quickly to Bruce's point and just to raise a different question. So Bruce, I take your point, but here's a puzzle that I have about it. So we think that in the interest of compassion, because we care about other people, just like we care about freedom, that in the interest of compassion, we think we're justified in paternalistically interfering in the lives of children, for example, because of their lack of competency. My point about advertising being manipulative is, if I'm reading Heath right, the environment in which we operate basically lowers all of our abilities to reason well and renders us less competent than we would have been in the absence of those manipulating forces. So here's my question. At what point does the forces of irrationalism or anti-rationalism undermine our capacity to be competent persons, such that other people would be justified in interfering with our free choices because of our lack of competency, just like we interfere with the lives of children? The point that I was making before is that if you conceive of adulthood as a purely descriptive concept, then that's going to leave a lot of people who behave incompetently or who reason poorly out of that loop. And then the difficult question is, how do you determine what counts as being a competent person, such that now you're an adult in the normative sense or in the evaluative sense? I just find that a tremendously challenging question. And the general stream of Heath's argument I'm getting is that we should collaborate in terms of trying to make the choice structure and architecture in which we operate in higher, more rational, so that would also lead to more people being judged competently. And one other point, right, Trevor, I think you want to distinguish between the justification for a market and the motivation that people have who operate within them. So although the profit motive explains the motives of people, from our society's perspective, the justification of a market is the extent to which it delivers well-being to the people who are part of that system. Anyways, I imagine other people are waiting. I saw a message from Robert, but I didn't quite pick it up. Sorry, Robert. I'll stop talking.
Did you want me to respond to that, Robert, or wait?
Sure, if you wanted to respond, then we're going to, my recommendation is we have one more question after this, and then we'll maybe call it a day. So we have that in the queue. Miriam wanted to ask a question, but if you wanted to just quickly respond, Bruce.
Sure, I'll be quick. I'll be quick. My response essentially is this. A preference for rationality is itself a preference. And by making that judgment, you're imposing your own preferences on independent people. That process you just described of considering whether or not those particular people over there are thinking properly and are really adults and are really thinking in the proper way is a thing that your brain went through yourself. And so you're giving your mental conclusions a higher priority for their lives than their mental functions are. And that is the definition of a lack of liberty.
Hello. Yes, so if we want to just move to Miriam, if you wanted to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. So, I'm a psychologist, and so I've been listening through that lens about, this idea of reasoning and description of counseling. As sometimes, people come in, they're not living their preferred life, and they want to talk to me about how they might live their preferred life. Sometimes, though, the work is also about, I kind of think about it in the language you were using, saying today, sort of misfiring heuristics, and they come to check some of their thinking and logic, and they're experiencing this misfiring. So one of the questions I had before, I guess I want to make sure that my question makes sense. So you've talked about these two systems, and I wondered where, I work with a lot of students who experience anxiety, so this kind of alarm system, fight, flight, or response, would that fit in that intuition system, or are there other systems that Heath discusses? So that I guess my first question.
Sure, yeah, I think I don't know is my short answer. I don't recall him talking about the fight, or response, but I think that would fit into something that, given that it's an automatic sort of thing, that it would be system one.
Yeah, and so my question, I was very interested in what you said. You cannot make changes to our intuition to try and make it work better for us. And so I had to think about our alarm system, which works automatically and sometimes misfires, tells people that there is a threat when there is no threat. And so the process is to have some insight, using reason to look at what is happening, our experience, and to say, okay, yeah, I'm having an intuitive experience that tells me there's a threat in the classroom, terrible things are going to happen there. I'm not going to go to class today, right? So there's this piece. Now, when people come for counseling for this, I can begin a process of having this other, like using reason to be able to observe that what is actually happening is that you have a system that is misfiring and is giving you problematic information. Now, it does seem that you can make changes to this alarm system, this kind of intuitive response, but it doesn't happen through insight. It can only happen through that person interrupting the, listening to the misfiring system and countering and having different actions that over time change the intuition that they have about this. And so I was asking how all of this fits with what you've talked about today.
Thanks, Miriam. I think what you're describing sounds to me like a cognitive override. Somebody who makes some sort of judgment or brings to bear some insight they have based on maybe the helpful advice that you give as a counselor, for example, when they're experiencing the intuitive response that they have. I think what Heath is saying is that because intuition, it functions in this serial processing way, it happens and it's automatic and it's fast. It's not something that we know actually how it works. It's like I can't explain how it is that I recognize your face. I just do it, right? So if I'm understanding you right, it sounds like the alarm system that you're describing is part of that as well. That's where people are feeling anxiety or something like that. But it sounds like you're describing a cognitive override of some sort of automatic response that people are having. And I don't really know. Like, I think one of the problems with the overview that I gave of his book is that I've overdrawn the distinction between 1 and 2. Because we also often engage in hybrid reasoning or hybrid thinking. So he gives the example in the book from one of who's the guy who did Blink, Malcolm Gladwell's books, about how people can cultivate very sophisticated judgment, but that marries their intuitive responses, say as art critics, with their understanding about the nature of art. So I think if there's a more complex story, I think it's oversimplified. I'll stop there.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Thank you. We work with emotions really as information, so that intuition, always sort of analyzing that from a rational perspective. So anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I don't know if Francis wanted to say any last words, but for me, I would like to thank Sync for giving this very interesting talk, and I particularly enjoyed the question and answer period. It was very informative, and I hope that we can do this again at one point with maybe another talk or in the next few months. Although hopefully at one point we'll have a face-to-face meeting somewhere in Canada,
Yes.
and not be in quarantine for the next 20 years or something like that. But,
yes. Thanks very much, Robert. Yes. So thank you so much, Sync. Thanks everyone for coming. We're going to try and work on the technology a little bit here. I don't quite know how to deal with all this breaking up of things and so on, but I'm hoping, although I noticed Mark Mercer's not here anymore, but we had talked, Mark, myself, Christina Boehm, and Louis Gork, about having a panel on self-censorship, which we were planning on presenting at the Congress, which we were hoping to present as a SAFS event, which might be in the next couple of weeks. I'm not sure if they're still interested in doing that. And then, of course, we have the Samir Gandesha's talk on June 5th, and then the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship event on June 6th during the day, which is already set. And that's going to have a number of interesting panels on it. One on, I believe Joanne Boucher is going to be presenting something on Hobbes, and then Stephen Perot, who is here as well today, and me talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity as a loyalty oath, which many of us have suffered the wrath of over the last few years. And then Samir Gandesha again is going to be giving the keynote on that. So that's a couple of things that are in the works. So I think that there'll be communications again through the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship and the Rational Space Network sort of mediums, and that will allow us to communicate to you about what's going to be planned. But anyway, thank you very much, everyone. Look forward to seeing you again the next time we have one of these events.
I just want to say thanks, Sink. I'm going to get the book. I'm going to order it right now and read it. Thank you, everyone, for this together.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Sink. Thank you all.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. And sorry again for the tech problem, but stopping my camera seemed to be a good help there for that.
Yes, that worked.
Live and learn.
Yeah. Oh, and if anybody wants my slides, they're text heavy, but that's deliberate because reason is explicitly articulable and linguistic. Just email me at smacrae@mtroyal.ca, or if you have Francis's email, she could pass on any requests, I'm sure. Thanks again. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Is there a space that we can get a hold